promised you I was going to give you an alternate way of considering the layout of the eyes. The anterior chamber, the posterior chamber, the anterior cavity, the posterior cavity. And the alternate way that I like to approach it, aside from looking at it anatomically, is to think of it in terms of like a floor plan, the layout of an apartment that you're going into. So instead of looking at it anatomically as an eye, I'm going to draw this in a kind of rectangle. So bear with me. I find it does tend to help people click this information together. So sort of the big rectangle. Your eye is now a rectangle. And there's two major rooms. So let's say like this is the front door right here. So you're going to have what we call the posterior cavity and the anterior cavity, like this. That anterior cavity is further subdivided, but not completely. So we're going to have an opening. Right up there, sure. I mean, this, I don't know why I drew that so poorly. That looks really stupid. Okay, let's redo that, just to make it more centered. It doesn't really matter. I'm being like a weird perfectionist with this. Okay, so the anterior cavity is subdivided into the posterior chamber and the anterior chamber. I don't have a lot of room, so I just did PCH, that's all that says. But that represents posterior chamber and anterior chamber if you've got time, space to write it. I'm not writing in here because I'm going to add a lot of stuff in. And that's really it. So from here, we can kind of add in what these barriers are. So to do that, I'll use a different color. This dividing wall between the posterior and anterior cavity, that's the lens. This space right here, that's the pupil. I kind of don't want to write directly on it because there's other stuff to put through here. So right here is the pupil. That space is the pupil. Which means that these are the irises. My handwriting is not the best right now. I don't think it's the most important thing about it to be labeling everything. I can kind of zoom in on this a little bit, or physically bring you closer just a sec. Now, back in the posterior cavity, you have vitreous humor. Up here in the anterior cavity, both posterior chamber and anterior chamber, you have aqueous humor. Now remember, here's your iris, here's your lens. Remember, you've got like a ciliary body, and that's going to be synthesizing that aqueous humor. And then that aqueous humor is going to circulate into the anterior chamber, and it's going to drain through the scleral venous sinus. Remember that guy? That little canal of Schlemm right there. So that's kind of stuff I've added in. You don't necessarily need it on your floor plan, but just to remind you of what makes this all related to each other. And that front door I drew, that would just be the cornea. My terrible handwriting, because it's getting late. That's the last thing I've done. Okay, so get this a little bit. Okay, so posterior cavity with vitreous, anterior cavity with a posterior chamber and an anterior chamber divided by the iris. You've got the pupil, that's the space, that's the opening that shares the aqueous fluid between these two spaces. The lens is the dividing line between the anterior cavity and the posterior cavity. The iris is the dividing line between the posterior chamber and the anterior chamber. The pupil is the opening between them. You synthesize in the posterior chamber, you reabsorb in the anterior chamber at that scleral venous sinus. So I hope that helped. Now I've got terrible lighting. Let's fix that. It is now fully nighttime. Okay, better lighting. Okay, I hope that helped. One more shot in case you're still trying to take notes. You could always repeat this video. I hope that helped.